this historical already.
I'm also glad to hear
The
somebody
purpose-
else get off a little bit.
The purpose of this interview
So,
is to identify. This is September 24th, 1995, in the home of Genevieve Carter.
But it's 1994.
Oh, I beg your pardon, 1994. I'm making this historical already.
I'm also glad to hear
The
somebody
purpose-
else get off a little bit.
The purpose of this interview is to identify some of Jen's perceptions of the School of Social Work in the community during its many years. But she won't cover 75 years. She will cover only what she can think of today.
I was born, though, of course.
Oh, yes, you were born. Well, so was I. So, all right, Jen. As I told you in the letter and on the telephone, what we are interested in doing is collecting the ideas that people have of the contributions of the school, not only within the university and the field of social work education, but also in the local community, statewide, national, and international. And from your time of arrival to the Welfare Planning Council as Director of Research in 1946, you've had continuous contact with the school in one role or another. So just let your thoughts free flow.
Well, one thing this morning that came out when I got my eyes open was Arlene Johnson and the big board meeting, the big Federation board meetings. Always had a hat with a flower and fresh white gloves and sitting like a lady monarch or something. And she was very well accepted by all the businessmen. And I think she had a wonderful committee, I'd say, awareness and a kind of a power to have the men think that she knew things she didn't even know. But they had such respect for her, and I was proud to be one of her working partners. And never, those fresh white gloves and that flower in the hat was her symbol.
Well, she was always the lady, and Vice President Robenheimer told me many years ago that when he was recruiting a dean for the School of Social Work, he had written to the University of Chicago, and they had recommended her very strongly. And he had seen some of those lady reformers from the University of Chicago.
Yeah, oh yes, we all know them.
And he thought he wasn't sure whether this would be someone he wanted to see. And here she came with a hat. Your comments remind me. And he was so taken with her that he offered her the job right on the spot.
Yes, anytime she came near the table, about 4 or 5 of the men were standing up with the chair to offer her.
Yes.
That's great.
Oh, let's see where. Let me get my time spot. I came to the council right after, toward the close of the war, and that was late summer, as I recall, 1946. And not very long, just a few days, or I think a month afterwards, the whistles were blowing and everything was exciting because the war was over. And then came the period of what we call the time for Reconstruction. Rosie the Riveter had already made her name, and women were in business, they were doing things, and they weren't going to be staying home all the time, and there was child care, and there was a George Nichols study that we made whenever we were trying for the legislation for the child care centers, and he was going to Sacramento. He apparently made quite a few trips during those years, And so that the legislators were saying if you build these child care centers or take care of their children, they'll be out at the bars all afternoon. And I said, well, let's just find out. So we did a study of child care in the state. Our sampling was by the different centers. Some of them were church, and some of them were attached to the place of work, and some of them were just more or less in the home with 5 or 6 children. But they were rather easily located, and everybody was willing
Well,
to
there
be in the
still
study.
were some Lanham Act funds that were disappearing for war.
That name is, I've forgotten just what that connection was.
Yes, they had through Lanham Act. There had been funding of child care centers in the school system, and every state had given them up, but not yet California. So George used this material that was gathered along with this about Lanham Act. He was the lobbyist then for beneficial management.
Oh yes, I remember.
And he used all of that, and his pitch was to save the Lanham Act child care centers. And he did.
And we worked all night getting the copies ready, and all the staff. It reminds me of these Pinko, or what is that? The advertisements, like they work all night.
Kinko's?
Yeah, Kinko,
Yes.
like a Kinko outfit, working all night to get it, because he wanted to pick it up in the morning at 8:30 and wanted, I've forgotten, I don't know, something like 90 copies. That was a lot for us to get ready. And so that we did cover, I think, about 100 interviews. We had a lot of people out. And it was to locate the mothers who were using the centers, not only have proof of where they were in the afternoon, that they were not at the bar having drinks and so on and so forth at a big time. They were either catching up with work, or they were doing chores and so on, and they were holding down 2 jobs. And it was a beautiful study as far as what the facts were. And there was no attempt for any kind of fancy statistical stuff. We just had questions and answers. And the factual answers were really more important to those legislators than if we tried to analyze background or age or so on and so forth. They wanted to know what they were doing, and we told them. And they were hard working, the women, with 2 jobs. And that was I think my first introduction to George Nichols. I didn't know just what his connection was at that time. So that we had students always, and I taught a community organization class. I don't think there were very many such classes in those days, because it was primarily casework centered. Social work was. It is, but Arlene was very interested in seeing something worked out, and I know this is just kind of on the side, but I was very interested in case recording, and I thought, well, I don't know why there can't be a record or a case record for each community organization project, which does have its goals and its time and its money limits and everything, so that I started 2 or 3 of the case records. And I remember Arlene was very, I guess almost, not Arlene, but Liggett.
Irene Liggett.
Irene Liggett was, because nobody had done any such thing. It didn't read like a case record, but it was a project record, and she said, well, she just lets her bubbling ego get out of hand sometimes. That there's no reason for a community organization record, but it was that we used it in classwork and found that it was very amenable, using the case record approach that we would use on one case, but on the project and project goals, which we participated, and the timing and the progress and so forth. So I don't know what you'd call that exactly a school center, but in a way it was, because it was brought right in the classroom, and we discussed it, and it with Arlene's Johnson's kind of interest, it's blossomed. So that was one incident, and then I remembered also when I first came to the council, we had a committee that was called the Japanese American Relocation Committee, because the Japanese were being released from the internment camps. So many of them, well, I suppose the majority of them were in California, because that was the idea. And we had, most of our committee members were faculty, and everybody was interested. And then there was a committee, I don't know if it was a doctor's thesis or a master's thesis, maybe you can remember, on the Japanese children's home.
It was a
Ford somebody.
I don't remember who
Student.
it was, but it was one of our master students.
So that's, and the issue was integration. The Japanese relocatees wanted something of their own in Little Tokyo, to where they could also hold other meetings for their community work. They were so eager to be a part of the broader community and be like everybody else, and do what they call charity work. And they had and the Japanese children in the Japanese home previously were all brought to Manzanar, where I had three children's homes brought by soldiers, babies in arms and all, behind the barbed wire, and these little enemy aliens were brought in to be kept there during the war if they had Japanese blood. So that the little orphans, little Japanese, were also in, some of them were in what the Seminole Catholic order was more of a missionary sector of the Roman Catholic Church. And they had nuns and priests. And the nuns were like little brown berries. They were real full-blooded Japanese from Japan. And they had, of course, the church there and all. So that I remember some of the social workers thought that you should start now and have integration, and if we had more races living together and so on, that it would solve future problems of anything happening like the relocation. And then I belonged to the other group. I really thought that they really needed something to call their own, and that they could point to with pride that they too were doing community work, and that it would be a gradual bringing in of other racial groups as it was suited, or that as it came about in a natural intake over the several years period. Now, I think that's what they finally followed, because knowing their pride and all, you just and the suffering that they had gone through, you had to be a little bit realistic as to how a community should look at this, and how you move toward better integration, but not theoretically. It has to be where it'll work for a while. So that was one issue I remember very well. And the school was very much involved in that, because we had lots of other meetings, because that was a serious thing then. So is there anything about that you...
Nothing that I remember specifically, but at that same time, I remember there was a study made of the number of whether, as well as the number, there were any black children in our institutions. And you worked on that with Irene Liggett.
Oh, yes.
And I was chair of the Child Welfare Division of the Welfare Planning Council. So I was
very well,
in that
and I
too.
remember Irene's favorite quote was, "We're colorblind."
Yes.
We just, like, it reminded me of Nancy Reagan's, just say no. You just can't say we're colorblind without a lot of thinking about how you get gradual acceptance and experiences that will change ideas and notions about interracial things rather than just a slogan. So that was a.
So the two of you work together at the welfare plan?
Oh yes, because
Yeah, I
I
was a
didn't realize
volunteer.
that. You were
you were a volunteer, but
And you
there
were
was-
at the school, Francis?
No, I
Not
wasn't. I was
you were in public
part-time.
welfare.
I was a graduate, but I was part-time teaching 2 courses in public administration and social work. And I was an administrator in public welfare, and that's when I became chair of child welfare. And let's see, it was later than that. Then I think you were the one who persuaded me to look at the history of the mental health committees. Was that you? In
Well, I
the
worked on
welfare
that.
planning
I think I
council?
was staff person because I come from psychology, that. And I worked. We had a survey. Al was on.
That's right. Well, I examined all the minutes from the beginning of time of mental health committees and the Welfare Planning Council, and I noted the fact that something would start and stop, a new committee would come along. I noticed that Arlene Johnson had been instrumental in starting the psychiatric clinic, the first one at Cedars-Sinai. We hadn't had one before. She also had been involved in starting the Mental Health Association for the County of Los Angeles. But it was that study which led Al to believe that we had to have a blueprint of mental health agencies in Los Angeles when he developed the idea of the county mental health survey.
Yes,
And brought Macmillan out for that.
I also recall those were the McCarthy days,
That's right.
where mental health, in some roundabout way, was associated with communism.
Oh, well, that was easy. It was easy to see how they got to that because, they were also working on getting the Short-Doyle Act passed, and Al was very much involved in that. And he was busily making speeches every place. He had set up a steering committee. He'd gotten Louis Bullock, remember that man?
Yes.
Louis Bullock to get the County Medical Society because Louis always responded negatively to anything anybody suggested. So Al, you may remember, told him that there were all these people who were against mental health, and immediately Louis was for it. So he set up a committee, the first committee, County Mental Health, and made my brother Jack the chairman of the committee. And Al had a heart attack. It was commencement day, and he had set up a very powerful steering committee that was going to work on the board of supervisors to get Short-Doyle into Los Angeles and so forth. And so I was the pinch hitter for the summer. The one thing he worried about all the time he was in the hospital was that committee. So since I was free that summer, I staffed the committee. One of the first tasks I had to do was to talk to a group of women in Pasadena. And it turned out they were the same ones who were anti-fluoridation, anti-mental health. They were the Minute Women. And but I remember so clearly as facing this whole group of women, and Wayne McMillan had told me what they were like. And one of them stood up and said, "Why do you want to have something called mental health? We have good mental health. That people will be, somebody will knock on the door of someone in the middle of the night and say, 'Away with you, you're crazy,' and take them to Alaska."
You thought they were going to say Russia.
No, to Alaska. I did two things. One was I asked them how many of them knew about Benjamin Rush, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Well, most of these were out of that. And I said, well, did they know that he was the father of psychiatry in the United States? Well, they didn't say anything more. But then I looked into this mental health thing in Alaska, and what I found was that in Congress they were then considering legislation to set up a neuropsychiatric institute in Anchorage, because Alaska was a territory, so it had to be done through Washington. And these people had translated that to mean that Alaska would be the place where everybody would be spirited away. And so that's what the connection was there. And McCarthyism was rampant then, but this was all one and the same thing, just different pieces, threads in the same fabric.
See, I have an idea that the council, the Welfare Planning Council, was at its peak about over 10 years ago. Well, it was as this balance between private philanthropy and government services came more into a 50-50 balance. Formerly, it was like, in some instances, 75 to 90% voluntary in leisure time and some of those some services. But as Helen Dean's report shows, it comes in several places where a government, city or county, merged to go together to provide some service continuity in a county. And there was this movement going fast that you had to bring government in and had to connect with voluntary and government, and then the voluntary would move into other areas. We thought of it as more or less a pioneering or a testing ground as to whether or not government should take it over after it was proven. But that has died out, and I think now the proportion of voluntary to public funds in the whole general welfare field is a very small, I'd say maybe 15%, something like that.
Well, community mental health, because the state really handled the hospitalizations and so forth.
Well, I would say,
but the change began with the Short-Doyle Act, and a lot of our faculty were involved in that, very active, both in the mental health survey, which was used in the Short-Doyle Act. So first they passed the Short-Doyle Act, and it was voluntary as to whether a city or a county, there were no private organizations that had 50,000 or more people could take it on, and then they would get state reimbursement. And it took a couple of years after that, and then Arlene worked with Al very closely on this. She was already retiring because the Short-Doyle Act came in 1957. She retired in 1959, and the summer that she retired, we were instrumental in getting the state legislature to approve funds to voluntary agencies who would have a contract. So, because they would hear nothing about voluntary agencies until then. That's when Lanterman began to get involved, and the person who reached him was George Nickel. because Lanterman was his assemblyman, and George is the one who got Lanterman and Al together to talk about the importance of the voluntary agency being in on this, so that they began to get 75% reimbursement for expenses. So the balance began to change then, I think.
And then it became, the fundraising just kept growing and developing, but there seemed to be a slowing off or a limit of what you could do with voluntary fundraising in terms of getting the money. And of course, I think ever since I recall the thousand lights of what Bush,
Yes.
but nothing. But another,
Something of light.
if that was what the volunteers were going to do, but nobody had tested that anyway to see what was the potential at this day and age for volunteers to take on all the things that he said he'd found, no more government, or cut down the government, and then more lights, more volunteers. But that nothing ever blossomed out from that. It was almost like just say no.
But one of the things that Arlene was very interested in was the role of the volunteer in a wide range of social welfare activities. And I think she was very involved in the Welfare Council out of that interest.
Oh, yes.
Too.
I expect, in fact, the Federation Board would really appoint her a lot of times.
That's right.
To see that such a committee was in action, and it could, and perhaps it would be better lodged in the council than in the Federation. But they, more or less, as I recall, gave her the broader assignment of forming the committee whichever place she thought it would operate the best, to report back what was being done.
Jen, on the telephone, you had recalled working on time motion studies.
Oh yes. Well, I have several things down here. One, I call it just the interest in what business was doing. Also in and that's got its momentous from an American. I can't. One of them who was time and motion studies specialist. He and his wife, and then another one who was more or less on evaluation and on what they would call quality. Instead of quality control, it became quality improvement, QI, in business, which means you didn't. It was a constant feedback and adapt and change basis, rather than waiting 2 years for the project to end and then to have some project evaluation results. It changed your whole notion about how you go about evaluating agency service, so that some of that was beginning to come in. And then I think it was at about the time that you started with industrial social work.
No, that came later.
Later.
Well, no, let me take that back. We had been asked by industry, George Nickel and I had been asked by industry to put on an institute on what managers in industry should know about money management, because the biggest problem they had then was not alcoholism, which it became later, but indebtedness, so that these companies were having to lay people, some of their best people, off, because if their wages were garnished for 1 or 2 or 3 times, the company policies were different, the person would be fired and they'd lose some of their best. So for 3 successive years, with the collaboration of the School of Business, we put on those institutes and the Planning Council was involved. And that was really our first involvement with industry. And then things had to wait. We couldn't get faculty to be interested in industrial social work until 1980. So there was a lapse of about 20 years in that. It took that long to get industrial social work acceptable to social workers.
Yes, that's I think it's understandable too, because now there was what's Helen Dean in her study called friction that comes up was frequently between the social worker, the more or less social work agencies, where they were interested in social work standards, as they call them, which is an awfully broad term, and what would be the quality of the social agency and its right to be supported, whether or not that they could draw or attract money. And then, of course, a little later on, fees for service came in, which made a difference too. It really helped, I think, professionalize it. So that was a slow change. But the social work philosophy and its way of doing things were frequently not what business and Chamber of Commerce thought should be. It was a meeting of very different kinds of people, and I remember some of that was very rough, and social workers certainly did not trust Chamber of Commerce people at that time.
Now, Jen, you had a lot of committees that were operating. You had a research committee. I remember Maury Hamovich was on it. I don't remember who else, but people from School of Business.
Oh, yes.
Bob Doxson.
Bob Doxson, and then my friend that you located to come to the, more or less, the party when I came to Los Angeles that time.
Oh, yes. I can't think of who that was.
She, a woman.
Yeah.
And she lived very close to, in that old section there in Los Angeles, and she was a very good, she was a pollster's expert too, political polls.
Yeah. Dinnerman.
B. Dinnerman.
No, B. Dinnerman was someone different. No, B.
She
Dinnerman,
was later.
Oh,
she was later, younger, and more of a community type
Right.
Now,
person.
I had occasion to call this other woman not long ago at your request,
Yeah.
and I can't think of her name. But there was involvement on the part of faculty as well as alumni in various committees that were quite important in the Welfare Planning Council.
Oh yes, they just about filled half the enrollments of all the committees. It was a very tight partnership, and that was true in most cities where there was a research department. That was really the beginnings of research, for the research in the schools of social work, because they'd had a sociologist, for instance, with quite good background, doctor's degree, and publications, and who knew about sampling and so forth, and that that was there because it came with a heavy influence from the Welfare Planning Council research staff in New York and Chicago and St. Louis, and you could mention most of the studies. Indianapolis, the Lilly Drug Foundation put up some money for quite a bit of research in those days too, council type research. And so that there began, as that developed, most of them had connections with universities of some kind. And certainly, to me, it more or less blurs together. I can't remember when something was not done together, either with students or as I was teaching there part-time then, 2 or 3 classes at different times. and it just flowed back and forth. It was very close.
Jen, why don't you jump, in my mind these are related, to the establishment of the Social Welfare Research Institute and what the kinds of things you did there, the regional.
All right, don't let me forget to go back to time studies in case.
Yes.
That was, I think, one of the most interesting things. So now, what you were talking about, say it again.
Well, let's go back to time study emotions. You told me on the telephone that you could draw a relationship between those time motion studies in which students and faculty were involved with you
Yes.
and today's HMOs.
Yes, because, the time and motion studies were certainly drawn directly from business. And the first one ever attempted, I guess maybe the last ones, with family service agencies. And we had the schedule that had you would write in what you were doing. Later on, we improved a sampling process where it would be what you were doing at a certain moment, and the moment would be sampled, or the days would be sampled, and it would be how much time doing what. And then that led into task analysis, which also led to some professional levels. For instance, we in the nursing, and we had students doing an awful lot of the research work, where they would respond to whatever task they were doing in the hospital with the patient, and we found that nurses were doing everything from maid's work and scrub woman's work to practicing medicine. And then that led to divisions of some professional positions. And then the same pattern followed in we'll say social work, where there were intern positions and there were assistants and so on, where the job was divided by the nature of the tasks that they were doing, and didn't always require the masters of social work or the doctor or the RN to do these particular duties and tasks because of the sub-professionals. And also it brought in many more minority people would get their start into a profession through coming in on these entry positions. So it was a trend at that time, and we certainly did have a lot to do with that. And I was telling Francis about social workers, caseworkers particularly, don't like to be pinned down too much exactly, well, would you say exactly what did you do? And which I'll lead off on that, all of the others. I don't want to lose that thread, but I must go back to one of my favorite stories of, I used to attend the Jewish Federation Board quite a bit, and they're a very vigorous, outspoken, active board, and the chairman was hearing a report from a caseworker who was telling about what they did in family service and how what the worker did and how it came out. And so she was giving a process report. I said this, and she said that, and we did this, and she did that. And so finally the chairman got up and he said, Ida, says, will you get off of the pot and get to the problem? Right at the board meeting. And so she said, we just want to know what was the problem, what did you do, and how did it come out?
We want to know what time it is, not how the clock works, huh?
Yeah, or we want to. Well, we don't want to know all this process. They want a direct line, cause and effect. I think is what they were really after. now what was I going to get back to? Oh yes, then the other little side story has to do with we'd get all these schedules in, and the students we give them training on how to score and how to mark it and so on. And one of them says, "Oh, look at this one." Says, "You don't have a category for this. I'm catching my breath. What do you do about that?" It's because the caseworkers really sort of rebelled. It was tedious work at that time, and the agencies were very careful to get all their copies, and they didn't want them floating around or anything, because they found such a large proportion of time was going into a category called case reading and study. Preparation for the next visit. And that was taking up like 40% or 30%, which doesn't make sense. The time is going somewhere else. So that it began to, I think, well, there was too a movement toward short-term casework then. A set time and short-term goals. And not just going on and on, where one interview leads into another because you have more information. It was a direct line between the problem situation and how much they were going to do about it and in what time. So it had I think a marked effect on at least internal agency studies. But it could have been misused. But everybody was more or less, after it was coming out in print and all, and each agency really was sitting on its private copy because they never wanted it out published at all. Well, it was discussed a lot, and I think it had a big effect because the agencies were also doing training of social workers. So it feeds back again. So that I think the time and what we'd call time and motion studies, but the study of what caseworkers do, just like what nurses do. It works in all of it. And then to get back to the HMOs, because there's the case management person really does an awful lot in connecting the different pieces of an HMO. And I hope they do more, because there are big gaps where people fall through. Now, right now, I'm not so sure who is I know my primary physician, but I really don't know, because I've had quite a few. I've had a neurologist brain person, and I've had the orthopedic person because of my walking. And I've had several different doctors, and I'm not too sure what I go to for what, or whenever I start having these peculiar headaches, like my head is frozen, and it's I feel as if the blood is not circulating in my head. Do I go back to my primary, or somehow your primary physician doesn't really see himself or herself as a case manager would do. And there's not much done or said about the case manager duties or the interests of the primary physician. Now, why is that? I'm asking you now.
Well, when you talk to primary care physicians about the role, their role vis-a-vis case managers, they will inevitably say, I am the case manager, and I direct the care of the patient, even though I may delegate certain responsibilities to others. I'm in charge. Because we talk to them about it all the time. So they would disagree. I'm not disagreeing, but they would disagree. And they feel, because we've just been through a big project studying how to link up case management with primary care, so I'm speaking from very recent work. They feel that they don't get paid for a lot of functions that need to be done with patients, such as talking with them and giving them information, and if it's not of a medical nature, they have no way to be reimbursed, and the expectations of physician, what's expected of them, they have to see people, all the time. They really can't sit down and talk with you for half an hour.
Your 15 minutes is your
So
average.
but now when you're talking about HMOs,
report, I tried to have an things that were on my mind and how I sort of changed my mind. At first, when I read the report, I tried to have an image of when I first came into the Welfare Planning Council as the research director, and I was talking to the various staff members about what they had as their workload at the present time. And I remember Helen Dean so well because she was a person that you don't remember very well. She was sort of average size, average weight, average looks, and sort of blondish. That was it is sort of an image that is difficult to describe. And she carried a brown leather type satchel, and her papers and her files were in that satchel as if she, carried it around with her all the time. It was the most precious thing in her life, and it comes out. It really was. And she, one of her early requests was that she hoped she'd have more time to get off with some of the work with the social statistics reporting system, where we were trying to get the county welfare department to begin to pick up its own reporting system and get that out of the way of the Chester Council, because there was too much weight put on the council for the jobs that the county should be doing. So that, and then of course the favorite topic of that day was unmarried mothers and getting services connected and coordinated, and getting some more homes. Of course, unmarried mother must be protected and not be
Now,
out.
this was in 1946, just
That's
as the
right.
war ended.
Just as the war ended, and I started to get into. I came to the end about at the end of the war. Then I got off from the American Japanese relocation camp at Manzanar in Southern California, and which opened up a whole new topic. I thought, well, I can't. This particular report is not about me and the World War II kind of thing. So that I had to keep wanting to, as I read through that report of Helen's, I did recall some of the things about the Sisters of Charity coming in with the material for the building, and just a few things became like old memories. But I still wanted to take it and rewrite it or redo it. And then I recall, I kept telling myself the purpose of this report is to, the board, the archives board, authorized a plan to reproduce the study in its present form for the sake of getting the material released and out. And how they got a hold of it, I didn't know. I wondered. But I thought, well, in that satchel and the way it was cared for, that she probably had it right in her bedroom most of the time instead of at the office. Where did it rest all of these, number of years before the board ever located it and thought about using it? Then one of the first questions she asked me was for more time to get off of those other reports, and particularly the reporting system for social services, which was a real obligation that went along with collecting funds, was accountability. So that was really important. But she said that she wanted to get off of that and have more time to work on the history. And I tried to find out, well, what committee, who authorized the history? Because Planning Council research is just not the kind that gets into history. You have urgent today's question from the budget committee or from a planning committee in family service or child welfare or some of the various groups of services, and I couldn't understand the authorizing committee.
Jen, may I interject
Yeah.
a question? Before you came to the research department to head it up right after the war, Helen had been working there.
That's right.
And who else was there? Was she in charge?
Well, I think she had been there longer, and she was sort of acting. But since the war was over, they expected to put more money into the research department, and they wanted someone with a doctor's degree.
So she was accountable only to Whit Pfeiffer as the executive until you came. Is
I
that
would
right?
say so, because she really didn't have anything in her workload that had to do with fundraising or with admission of new social welfare agencies and some of the matters that would be most important to the fundraising side. It was more in terms of counsel, and in those days, as I said, they were interested in unmarried mothers and adoption, organizing adoption services and other kinds of things that were sort of urgently needed for social action at that moment. So that she found her own problem and her own research load. It was very, very wrapped up in it. It was like it was her life. And the fact that she didn't keep her papers about that particular study in the regular files, but had it in this special old leather thing that she carried around, like an old legal brief packet of some kind. That you got a feeling right away that this was her life. Her main priority. So that we talked quite a while about that, and then I said, well, we have to, see what, talking with the council, Whit Pfeiffer and the divisions, and then talking with fundraising, because they were the top dogs, even in that day. Whoever brought in the money and who had the influence to raise money was not neglected. And if it had to be neglect somewhere, it would be where it probably would have to take a long time to develop the agency and the service and the support required for that agency before it could become a member. And they didn't want too many people knocking at the door to be included in the list of agencies for the community chest unless they could carry their weight in fundraising. So that the priorities were not particularly spoken out loud, but everybody knew that that's the way the fundraising and the chest had to go.
Would you clarify something
Yeah.
for me? If the Welfare Federation Board had under it the community chest on one side and the Welfare Planning Council on the other, how active was the Welfare Planning Council actually in the fundraising?
Well,
Aside from budgeting, I remember that they had all these budgeting committees
Well, they were personally into it in terms of everybody had to drop your workload and so on, and during campaign time, your time would be to help out in fundraising if you could, no matter a lowly job or one that would be a personalized gift from someone, so that there was not and to release more research time for marketing, we'll say, and getting more into demographics and all, to be able to show to show accountability for how many Boy Scouts in this area, how many children in the institution in a particular planning area. We had 100 planning areas, and those were the years when Los Angeles was growing so fast. An orange orchard one day and a whole community with new housing the next. It was a fascinating, exciting period to be in, but so that you had to move fast. And these chests then wanted more research. Some of it just simple information, such as your gift of $25 would buy X number bottles of milk for a certain children's institution, on a very common type basis, so that they wanted more help to brace up their marketing. That was the pressure right then. And then also more help in delineating the 100 planning areas. And they had the valley, and they had the different names of the sub-councils were developing across the territory in order to give them more of a hold on the population and its potential for giving if they did not collect at the business. I gave it to office,
Yeah.
quote, is a very important expression, and that they were really developing the first steps in a gave at the office type of response.
Now, at that time, this was the city of Los Angeles.
It very
Because
soon,
Pasadena,
yeah,
Long Beach,
it was-
Santa
it was-
Monica had their own.
well, yes, it was called Greater Los Angeles, and very soon it was the United Way, and they were incorporating other territories. And then there was in the opposite direction, there were like the Boy Scouts in the San Fernando Valley were getting their fingers on the donors, and then they wanted to separate because they thought they would do better with their own fundraising than to be included in the overall United Way.
But they had the example of the American Red Cross, which
That's
was
right.
not included.
Because they thought they would do better. And now she mentions it in the report, Helen does, and there were quite a few things that I started to take out, but then that would mean I was analyzing it. But she used the word friction. There was friction here. The friction between the agencies and the chest and the fundraising. That instead of saying, having anything about the value system and their priorities were different, and where that is, it was a matter of social need and social problems versus a campaign success. And then, of course, its background in the merchants and manufacturing and the Chamber of Commerce comes out very clearly in there. And I was amused because we just thought of it as being something very natural to work with the Chamber of Commerce. And they had the research committee that I was a very faithful member of. And that was also the census committee. And I found out, to my surprise, that the census committee didn't just help the federal census machinery in taking the every 10-year census survey, but rather you bought in. Manufacturers would want this item or that item. If you wanted to get the item on is there a disabled person in the house, it would take more money than the feds put up. So you had to get more money then for some of the social problems, because in a competition, even in the census taking, was really one that where the merchants and manufacturers wanted their items in first in terms of age of the family and so on. I remember one merchant had silverware, the first set of silverware for the young married couples, and he said he wanted, if he couldn't get something more about the young married couples, where they were living, their ages, and their concentration, and he wanted to know how many of them, because that was what he was going in business for, and he wanted that information, that kind of data. So there were different value systems working all through that, and as she mentioned, she called them frictions, and every time she used the word friction, you had a real little kind of a jewel there, because it pointed out an important difference in the value system at that time. And that's what I got interested in. I said that would be, just to follow through and find these little clues would give good leads to another history, a survey, or it would, for especially somebody who had more sophisticated information and practice in history methods. Hers were homemade and home learned, that she used. That if she could have been a little more, if she'd been a little bit attuned to historical methods, she would have had a much richer kind of writing in what she wrote in this report. But she had, the clues are there. I noticed a lot of them. So I would hope that sometime that there can be, maybe we're digressing again, come back to it if you remind me, but that the fact that we have these value systems popping up with the tramps, for instance. And I remember my mother talking about the tramps. And one of the choice things which I did mention in the notes here that had to do with the value system and the work ethic is just very strong here, where how put out the government officials, city, and they were combining city and county in a lot of places too. There's a lot of these changes going on. Was that because they didn't have a rock pile and the wood pile. They could not keep the materials stacked up for when these tramps came in, so that it would be workfare and not welfare. And there's almost something nostalgic and mixed with something sad, because it's so prominent now. You could just trace these things, and especially as the health plan begins, and the welfare reform is going to be looked at. It'll be the same old story again, the worthy poor, and to make them worthy, you had to have that rock pile and the wood pile, and when they ran out of materials for them to work on, they were very upset. So that these little clues in there, somebody who has a real good ear for history should have a grant and do a follow-up. Begin with some of these things that are now, so old and reappearing all the time. They're deep. The value changes, or lack of change, rather. She called them points of friction. And the work ethic as a concept doesn't come in at all in there. I got off the. But these are things that I ran into that sort of attracted me to this. I call it like the unfinished symphony, the unfinished manuscript. that somebody must come along and pick it up and do something and carry it a little further. And then I thought it reminded me of this celebration they're having, you see.
Why don't you put some?
The celebration they're having now. I think there would be money available. The celebration is, of course, did you trace that down some?
Point that the monograph would come out at the time of the anniversary of the community chest. If there are daily articles about the agencies in Albuquerque,
Yes.
will you cut them out and save them?
Yes, I think if little old Albuquerque can do something like that, well, that's no reason why Los Angeles shouldn't make a pretty good splash.
Well, we'll use Albuquerque as a model.
Yeah, but
Now
somebody
they-
has to
Now
plan.
they had one agency in that issue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I gave
Yes,
you-
I saw it.
Yeah.
So that's and they're going to take one a week. Wasn't that what they said?
Yes,
In the paper?
this article, which is dated September 5th, says that there will be one agency's
So there's
history
already
given
been
every week.
2 weeks, 2 more.
Yeah.
You see, what I thought was what came through my head next. That's why I say this whole monograph really sparked so many things in my mind that I want to really to kind of rewrite the whole thing. But that here was this one a week, and I thought, well, now this would be a good time to build for the archives. Each agency, first you have a workshop on history methods, and everybody in one lesson learns all about it. But you have an outline, and you have some of the theory behind it and everything. And every agency is allowed a big budget of $25 or $50 from the chest for expenses, and they write their own. It goes through their board, and then you have for the archives you have every agency that's a member today or somebody who wants to write some of the others, and I think that's the way to take advantage of something like this and get the work done. Now they're going to have sort of a newspaper investigators, but you don't really get. You'd have to do quite a bit of legwork to find out the sources that she really used in her report.
Let me take just a second to orient us to this material of Helen Dean's. It was found among other documents, we found them really quite some time ago, and they've been sitting in our files. Evidently nothing was ever done. We seem to have the original statement.
I call them storage files in my notes.
Well, that's a polite term
Yeah.
for what
They weren't even. They were
are.
just.
But as
Where
Ruth-
were they found, Francis?
in some materials that were given to the
Just
archives,
given
as Ruth and I looked at this document, what it seemed to be was Helen Dean's perception of the history of social welfare agencies in Los Angeles up to the point where the community chest began, and then a whole new system was developed. Now, she does not document almost anything that is here, so that, and sometimes she refers to sources for the information.
Or a meeting of a certain date, but you don't know.
Yes,
Even
she gives us the
Uh-huh.
population on a certain date, evidently taken from the census, because they're in 1920, 1910, the dates of census collection. But there's very little to identify what her source of information is. Now, in putting it out as a monograph, we're not saying that this is authenticated history.
I call it the unfinished, like the unfinished symphony. The unfinished,
right.
Unfinished monograph, Helen Dean monograph.
And it's what she had put together, and that's how we're publishing it, so that any mistakes that are in it, we are not
We're not correcting.
planning
That's right.
to correct.
That's right. That should be in the preface, and I do have it in my notes in the preface.
Yes.
No additions, no further revisions, and so on. Just as it is sort of purity. Well, I almost said like the unfinished symphony, but I wouldn't want to compare it with that.
The quality is somewhat different. The plain Plane is
But
different. too.
I just call it the unfinished monograph.
But as we put it together, it's in itself a historical document.
The lead.
And that's really what we're publishing.
So many steps are exposed in this, where you can really go,
Yeah.
lead out.
So some of the things that you've identified, like her points of friction, this matter of the worthiness of people, which we hear today
Oh,
from Mr. Huffington
the
and others.
vocabulary is precious.
Absolutely.
Yes, so that I think the pointing to some of these is significant, and the reader may very well find other points of reference too. So I don't think we need to feel apologetic for the fact that there may be some incorrect statements.
Oh, yeah, oh.
The only thing we're doing, and Ruth is doing this, is correcting some grammatical things, but nothing in the way of
Yeah, for
content.
example, twice I saw the word gave literally, which I'm sure is liberally, you see. Just a few things like that. And this one place where I thought was, I would just love to see what that's all about. That surprisingly, how was that worded now? Oh, the Southern viewpoint was very liberally supported. Civil War. See, 1950 included the 60s with the Civil War, and it's not. She did have Civil War kind of at the side, but never. I said, what would the Southern viewpoint be? And how would you need money for the Southern viewpoint? So but that would take quite a bit of investigating to.
Well,
trace it
that's
down.
not where we want to put our resources, but in and of itself, it's an interesting document of one person's perceptions. But it has some interesting things, like the Sisters of Charity coming around the
Oh
horn.
yes. There are quite a few interesting things
Yeah.
in there that I didn't, I sort of got to where I didn't worry about how it got there, or how it was written down, but it fit right into that period in history. And then whenever I thought one of the charming things was whenever the governmental officials got so upset because they ran out of rocks and they ran out of wood to make it a real make them worthy clients, so that it wouldn't be it was the workfare ethic that we have right now that's coming into everything from the health reform and the welfare reform. You want to jump to that right away because it's still with us so very plainly.
A question, Jen.
This was a certain amount of kind of old antagonism, because she was so independent in what she wanted to do and how she wanted to spend her time, and what she Of course, I think too, maybe she thought she should have been appointed director.
Well, you know, when I interviewed Ernie Greenwood in Berkeley this summer, he spoke about Helen when he came to the Welfare Planning Council, to the research department. He didn't know about the history, that is, he didn't mention that, but he did describe her way of working in solitude, not interacting with anybody. This is some of the same kind of things that you have mentioned. But I think that if we could have your thoughts, what you think might go into a preface.
Of course, also just talking out loud and sort of the stimulus of having two people here brings
us,
out
you know.
some of the things that I didn't have in my notes. But most of them, see, each time, well, I did write this over once, but it didn't improve much.
Take your hand away from your mouth.
It didn't improve much. The main thing is, if something strikes me, there's usually a reason that I can get in.
Well, do you want to go over your notes and tell us those, and let's see what we have?
If we have anything there. It isn't even here, but it reminds me. I'm talking about the rock pile, and then another one that's where she said, got into friction. Let me see. I don't want to lose that either. Oh yes, close to Spring Street, there was Charity Street, where the poor who must depend upon the what was the word? The beneficence. I love some of the words. The beneficence of the more fortunate. It could be brought together to sort of keep an eye on them so they wouldn't contaminate. It wasn't said, but that was more or less the words. And with the tramps they have to take care of, it's the homeless thing over and over again. And the fact that it hasn't changed locations much, because that part of Spring Street still has submissions and all.
Yes.
And that's the same value motivations are operating. And while, do you have this on there?
Mm-hmm.
There's one story that I hope gets saved in some way, but the community chest side and the fundraisers were always more or less protection, not separation of church and charity, but it was more, they didn't want proselyting. Everything else could be, separate religions, and they had many expressions about regardless of creed and so on, that this would must be observed. Now, cut me off right now.
Cut you off?
Go back a little bit so I can. Well, so the fundraisers wanted a team from the research department to go into what would be what they call charity row then. That was really the Skid Row section, where they had submissions, and they wanted to know the effects of the preaching and the sermon before the evening meal was served, or they were given a bed. So that they had to send in statistics, which we put in this big statistical pool. So they made up their own. But what amused me was that it was good thinking, conceptualization. They had how many in this evening's service raised their hands for Jesus? counted. This was quantified. And then how many stood up for Jesus? Counted and quantified, you see. And then the third level was how many come forward for Jesus. And then in order to get to the dining room, you had to come forward. And well, you know, the degree of involvement conceptualized is really, you know, so interesting how they did this. So that, and then we said, well, I wonder how they feel about it. And we said, well, let's ask them. Ask. And they didn't think anything about it. That was all right. That's the way, if you want a meal tonight, well, you do, if you're invited as a guest, or you do what's expected of a guest. And no, it doesn't bother us if I stand up. Maybe I won't stand up tomorrow, you know. So that it didn't hurt them. It didn't hurt their dignity in it. And we were the ones that were so worried about imposing Christianity on them. They didn't think that was out of line at all to get your meal in a bed. Whenever we said we're going to define duplication as the same service to the same people at the same time. And when you got down to the duplication, it was really if the caseload increased in the community or the needy increased, then you were going to have what looked like duplication because there were too many people. So, you know, they could count too many heads, and so on. That it was growing, but not from duplication. It was because of that there was more need, and if you define it, then that sort of takes care of it. That you don't hear so much about it. And that was a very important issue with the businessmen. At the same time, the businessmen did want to bring in some better accounting, and especially of service and of service distribution, and particularly of new areas that would come into the chest so they could feed back the next year how they have profited by X number of people and who are now being served over last year, 25% increase in the number of people, unduplicated count, and that therefore you should give more. I think the one that the rock pile and the wood pile is on that one. It reminds me of I don't know why I should say this, but what's his name? The name that bothers me was the Republican who's so rough about his talk and all. Senator Dole.
Dole. Mm-hmm.
That's
Dole.
In some ways, if somebody had a sense of humor and write a column on, we'll say, Dole's proposal for a certain thing, and then use all of these same ideas and values, and say, oh, this was written in 1939. We must have got it mixed up with some of Dole's current studies, because they sound just like it, you know. Mm-hmm. I said one of the features of this unpublished monograph is the use of language and concepts in common usage during the history time period, and how it's carried on today. And Helen Dean used the word friction whenever referring to conflicting values that still exist and are repeated as we move toward a national health plan and welfare reform. Attempting to use these, the use of the worthy poor and the able-bodied continues. The concepts still continue today, and the differences we have in who is a needy person, and then the charity street and the isolation of sort of like a public health type of prevention, get them segregated out of the population so they don't contaminate. And of course this gets into the shelters of the homeless. Did you this digression, but I think is I got such a kick out of it. But a program that was going on, and who was able-bodied. It was I mentioned the whenever they didn't have the wood pile or the rock pile, I suppose it's like the prisoners, I guess, that were chained together, and they had to pound up the rocks. They used them for roadways and so on. I couldn't imagine what they were using the rocks for until I thought of the striped suit, people out on the highways chopping the rocks for building materials and for the roadways. So I suppose that, and then they could use it, and they could always have it ready. And in the wood pile, some families kept a wood pile before they would hand out the plates to the tramps. This had to do with the work fair type of thing and what's going on. I started to write by issues, and I said, well, that's not what I'm supposed to do. I'm writing another volume. I guess that was what I had this out for, to explain. It's awfully easy.
To include here.
Well, I was this is just setting the time span.
Mm-hmm.
And then the fact that the manuscript was buried or lost. When the Social Archive Foundation, I couldn't think of a proper name here, reviewed the manuscript and set plans in motion to make this report available for historical use. And then this Helen Dean manuscript has been kept as an unfinished document. That's pretty good word too, unfinished document. And the issues that reappear in the development of today's social and economic assistance programs have their roots, the beginnings, right in this manuscript. The issues may have different names, language, but the Helen Dean manuscript identifies some of the critical issues, which are repeated throughout the year, the years, plural. Well, this doesn't really belong in a preface.
Yes.
Why not?
Yes.
Why not?
Yes.
I think I'm getting into interpretation of issues.
Well, that's all right. I think this is good.
That's good. I agree.
But not carrying it far enough. Consider the following: the worthy poor and the able-bodied poor, and the dilemma of not having ready work pile ready for them to earn before the money or food is given, and then the tramp population and the street population. And then I had this quotation from Shakespeare that I liked so much, of the past is prelude for the future. I love that expression. Mm-hmm. But when you get out of the past and you start according to the prelude, you're in another phase of writing. Because the interpretation and the weight of this material against that material and so on, is another level of writing. which
But
is,
the reader who is a researcher can draw those interpretations.
well, yes, you want to write. It makes you want to write, because all you stupid people, don't you see, we're doing the same damn things over again.
Well, that's what we need to emphasize
that's
in an
right.
archival project.
That's right.
And that we don't learn that the past is prelude to the future. And it was, and I caught, and it's been moved to other places, but that's the whole thing. In fact, I thought the preface should be named just from Shakespeare's The Tempest, and I have the line and everything here that I call Blanche Cole. See where it came from, and you should know. And she's a good person because she's written so much in social welfare. As a historian, to come for 2 days and put on a workshop for agencies who wanted to write their own history. Should have something in their history files or in their old files that would just be wonderful to get into, because Los Angeles was considered one of the 2 or 3 top councils in chess and with leadership. And I remember so well how we kind of laughed because Whit Pfeiffer's wife
Let me see if this is picking up.
You get together with the Unraised project after you came back from Australia.
yes.
You became
That
a
was,
consultant on that. That was in about 70.
Yeah, one.
Well, Al had hired Ray
Ray, did he? Yeah.
to do some studies on nursing homes. That would have had to be
Earlier.
before January of '76. And
Okay.
Ray had already been there a couple of years.
Yes, yes. Well,
And
Ray had done a study for administration on aging,
mhm.
because I, out of the Research Institute work that I did some consulting on
Mhm.
that project around contracts because of that contracting project I had done. That was before the case management study, which we call case coordination.
yes.
But Jen
Yeah.
got involved with that study.
Yeah, I guess I was.
Consultant. You
Well,
were,
something like
you were our
research-
principal consultant.
Something like that title.
Yeah.
But it was attached to a particular project.
Right.
I didn't have an administrative title
No.
attached to the Gerontology Institute.
No.
And I'd say it was primarily on what you'd call soft money.
Right.
Well, will you talk a little about case management? because I think that was a very special contribution.
Absolutely.
And I think it needs to be noted.
Well, that continued, of course, not only there, but after I came to Albuquerque. And I was a registered lobbyist with Virginia Crenshaw and I for 2 years, getting in case management into two of the public welfare departments of 2 counties. And going to Santa Fe and shaking hands and doing all of the promotional work, so that my last phase of my interest in gerontology was in getting case management into county structure. And
Were you doing that? Were you a lobbyist for the State Commission on Aging, or what were the auspices?
What was the base of operation?
Yeah, well, yeah. Under whose auspices were you doing this?
Just very much our own.
But who is our?
Virginia Crenshaw and I.
You mean as individuals,
Yes.
not connected with any organization?
No, we were volunteers.
Volunteers for what?
Volunteers.
I'm trying to get
Well, I
the.
would say working maybe primarily out of the Senior Center Association, Office of
Yeah.
Senior Affairs, because I was the president of the board for the Office of Senior Affairs for
Well, that's
3
what I'm
years.
trying to
For
get.
3 years.
Isn't that the area agency on aging here?
Well,
Yeah.
the area agency on the state agency on
Yeah.
aging puts in quite a bit of money.
Yeah.
In fact, the Office of Senior Affairs is usually like Greater Albuquerque or Central New Mexico, so that it was a large organization with about 6 or 7 centers, senior centers.
But they function like an area agency, the Office of Senior
Well,
Affairs?
I remember the area agency division, but it was not the same. That was strictly state, as I recall, here in New Mexico.
It didn't function in the counties.
Yes, it did. It would cover, say, 3 counties or something, some geographic division like that. Forgotten just how many counties were in the area agency.
Well, in Los Angeles County, there's an Office of Senior Citizen, Community and Senior Citizen Affairs, and within that is the area agency on it. One of their,
Yes,
yeah, and it
was
sounds like
within
it's
that.
similar.
And plus, would say 6 or 7 different senior centers
Right.
and their
Right.
territories.
Right, right.
And some of the budget would come from the state level, which would be to the area and the senior centers.
Now, Jen, when we go up to the Baptist Center where they didn't give us any ice so we couldn't drink, who put on those conferences? Were those the state?
Oh, you mean the state?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, the state would pay for that.
But what in the state? The state commission?
The state office on agency.
State office
See,
on
every state
aging,
has
so
to
that-
have a state
Right.
office.
Everyone
And here, it's quite strong in New Mexico, and it's a very important political appointment, but with so much backing and power in the various counties. It's a very strong organization because this is an active senior citizen state.
Jen, going back to when you came to the when you worked with Ray on the case coordination
Yes.
project,
How does
do you remember that much of our work that we did on that project was trying to describe and define this work
Yes, what
that
is
came to be known as case
what?
management?
That was one of the first. The conference, I think, covered 3 or 4 days.
Yes, I remember
And
it
that
well.
it was set up for a conference was quite loose because it was to get more words and more
The language,
material,
right.
material from the participants, so that it was there may be maybe 15, 20, 25 people in this huge room, and the moderator job was one of the most important, to get this material out, to get what each of these various, there were 13 different, I remember that part,
Yes.
Different organizations or agencies says we do case management.
And you know, we have the proceedings of that.
Yeah,
Do you?
I'd like to see those.
We have the proceedings of that conference.
And I think that will give me what I'm
writing.
asking for.
In writing.
Oh yeah, well it was
A document.
the proceedings. Yes, the proceedings we did write up.
And remember, Barbara Schneider helped.
Yes, yeah, I remember her very
Barbara
well.
Ishizaki then.
Are they in our library?
I'm sure they are. If not, they're in my library.
All right.
Well, that would be a very good source of what professionals were doing.
Still one of the best ones. I actually use it once in a while, you know, especially with students, because it was so good.
And it was right to the horse's mouth type of
Right.
thing. And this is what we do. And then the next session, well, who gets it? And from that became certain behaviors that more or less would make an index. And I was very interested in that. And part of it that I worked with had to do with activities of daily living, if you remember
Right.
that.
Right.
And that so that we could, and then you want to, that had to be reduced to more or less a checklist, so whenever the case manager went out to visit a home, she could quickly check off certain things. And we had an expression that, well, if it's full-blown incontinence, you got it made.
Yes.
That was one of the
Deciding factor.
Yeah. Yeah, and we thought that if you could say no incontinence, well, I don't know, you know, then you'd go try to see what were the other possible. Like she couldn't feed herself because of no hands, or there's some of the, it couldn't get to the toilet, or some of the other activities of daily living. And then I did help out with, you know, trying to get to where there's, we'll say, some have more weight than others, and we have to weight the factors if we're trying to quantify it.
We did do quite a bit of work on the assessment piece, but do you remember the other piece was the compendium of guidelines from the literature? A huge
Yes.
amount of work, because I know I worked on that one, where we reviewed the literature as thoroughly as one could at that time and categorized around this kind of work what people had written and
Yeah,
said.
really, it was a
Well, I have that also.
yeah, it was a very good method of approach.
Yeah, it was.
In trying to find out from practitioners and what they do, and get it in an orderly fashion to where it was beginning to develop almost like a theory, untested, that is not research, but a theory that guided practitioners that they were using.
And the other thing
Do you have
did-
those available in your
I do.
library?
I do.
Because maybe you could just pull them
Pull it all
together,
together.
and Ruth doesn't have to go
Right.
scurrying around.
The other thing we did out of that project, Jen, is develop, I think, the first directory, a national directory. Do you remember? There are about 300 agencies that we identified at the time that were doing this work, that were...
Yeah, and then some of the ethics of practice came out too. I remember one had to do with, we say, if it's an agency that offers the service, and you have a joint project of case managers, it would be unhealthy for it to be influenced to refer cases to your own agency because it would put you in position of feeding the money back to yourself.
We used to say, he who coordinates shall not provide.
Yeah, that's it. That's it.
I remember it very well.
Yeah, that's what I call ethics. And they're so good.
But that's an important...
Well, it is, and it's very much in debate today, because there are many reasons why you can build a stronger continuum if you do also provide, but you have to have a lot of built-in checks and balances. It's very
And you can
complicated.
add in case management to the budget of some that's strong and ongoing, easier than you can start fresh with funding and with case management and expand to resources.
But you know, the contribution that you and Ray made to the area, to the arena, is very significant. And you know, your book, I don't know how you've done on it, but it certainly is quoted a lot, it's utilized a lot.
Well, we did get along personally very well with writing that book. In some places, it was, sometimes he'd grab something and run away, you didn't know he's even gone on something else. And I'm sure I had my I contributed my problems too. But when it came to the writing, it was very harmonious. And sometimes he'd write the first draft, and sometimes I would. And we went chapter by chapter in putting it together. So that those were very pleasant working days. It went fine. And we published this, after we'd published the proceedings in a mimeograph type form, it wasn't too difficult to move into the book.
Right.
But then, of course, I look back on it now, and the book was so heavily influenced by these, I think there was about 13 grants or projects out in the field from the Office of Senior Administration on Aging, where case management was being made possible as a program. And that in a sense, confined it, because we brought in almost everything like visiting nurses or other kinds of program where case management was very minimal to where it was one of the major features of the agency. Then we had another sort of a theoretical possibility that didn't work. So I have to remember that and tell it, because it was too ambitious a community coordination job. And that was that there would be a single entry into the case management world through a single entry and a case study to produce the plan, and that all the resources would be available, but it would include all elderly, which was impossible. It was tried but didn't work. So sometimes you can get too ambitious with your efforts for coordination of services and kill it off by the magnitude.
Still trying to do that in some places.
So the book was a little bit, there are several places in the book where it mentions the single agency.
Yeah.
And the single agency means a single entry.
Right.
And every older person, just because he's older and maybe having a difficult time, gets put into this pot. And maybe he doesn't belong in that pot at all. It's who's eligible and under what conditions.
The issues are absolutely the same,
Mm-hmm.
because I was there sort of from the early days on, but some of them have gotten more focused. But this thing about providing and coordinating is just a hot issue. And there's even language in the legislation that the area agencies have tried to get through, and they may win, saying no one who provides any service at all, including a hospital, may do the assessment of a client, and
Yeah.
except area agency, except area agencies. They're exempting themselves because they provide a lot of services. Home care, information referral,
Is the idea that they
transportation.
can be more trustworthy and objective than
Well,
other
Depends who you
organizations?
talk with, but yes, basically.
Uh-huh.
So you can imagine the hue and cry across the country, since everybody does case management of
Yeah.
some kind or another. So, and that's real interesting. But the issue of the single entry,
And
should
the
there
single
be
agent,
one, single
having
agency?
an agency called the Case Management Agency is was debated heavily, and I think it probably still
Well,
is.
I hate to tell you, but there are still discussions about what is case management.
And
I
then
would
we,
say, oh no, I can't take another minute of that discussion. But
I don't think we even had quite a bit of space in that book that was allocated to the single agency approach as one positive and very fine choice to make.
But you really laid out a number of organizational structures for case management. The single was one, and then you had all these different models, the freestanding and under different auspices,
Yes.
and
Yeah,
how
oh,
it
yes.
would work. I mean, I remember this very
In
well.
some ways, you see, we did have a definition, but it wasn't. It was a sort of a limited one. But for that time, it was probably
that
as
was-
best you could come out with. But we didn't lift it up to a little higher level to where you could generalize more.
Well, I've heard that study referred to as the Seminole study in case management by people outside.
So it would be fair to say that it was
It's
a significant
Very
contribution.
significant study, that 3-year study.
Well, what has been published since then? Did you get your book published that you were working on for? You and a co-writer.
Yeah. No.
You never came.
In fact, I've just been contacted by the publisher, Sage, because the editor of there was a series on working with the elderly in case management, and I had been approached to write the community piece, and Lynn Goldis and I wrote our half of. We were supposed to write half the book, and the editor was going to write the other half, and we did our half. And he disappeared. Nobody knows where he is. Three of the six.
Like Helen Dean.
Yeah, like Helen Dean.
Yeah, it's a
Three of
mystery.
the 6 volumes were published, and he was a part of them. And then he was gone. He was at what was the university in St. Louis, the School of Social Work?
Yeah, Washington.
Washington. And to this day, we don't know where he is. So Sage, very recent,
Who was that?
Joel Leon. And Joel, I don't know where he is, and nobody knows. And Sage just contacted me because I had run into someone and said, I wrote something and I want to quote, I want to use it. Is it still mine or is it yours? Who does it belong to?
Mm-hmm.
And they said it was still mine. And so I lifted something that I needed it for something else. So then they contacted me and said, we'd like to see your manuscript. Maybe you should think about expanding it, and we'll do a book, either as part of this same series or as a new. This was 5 years ago. But I've published quite a bit since, articles, nothing nothing big. Articles and a couple chapters and so forth. I probably have a couple.
Well, my writing has certainly changed. Now, I do have 53 published articles,
Yeah.
but they go from everything to, we'll say, whatever, one of the very early ones, Democracy Behind Barbed Wires. Isn't that, intriguing? That was the life in the nuns in our
Sure.
camp, and so on, and going from preschool to then into like the life at the Mount Zinar, and then child welfare, the use of time by adolescents, with Harold and Mary Jones, and then on through to. I never did do so much with family, but I certainly, when I got into gerontology, for the elderly, then I continued writing for that specific age group. But I've sort of grown all the way through from the preschool to particularly adolescence and child care. I mean, the child care, they didn't call them child care centers, but they call them, and there were about 7 or 8 across the country, and Berkeley had probably the best one. Child research centers, I guess they were called.
But don't forget that Joe Kuna was also involved in that project.
That's right.
He
That's
was
right.
in our school. I was trying to think about who else.
Yes, I think that's good
left
information.
over. And remember Joe Kuna?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, and I think he was the other person from our school.
Yes, and he's now the head of the aging program for Pennsylvania.
He's no longer with aging. He's with child welfare.
Child
Yeah,
welfare,
that's, you know,
yes.
that
Child
must be,
welfare.
Child welfare.
some way
Yeah,
or
I
another,
talked with him.
if you're interested in one segment,
Yeah.
you can move quickly, easily to another segment because of the linkage, the life linkage.
And you know, there's a number of people, I'm sure you know, from School of Social Work who went into aging, at least for a while. Dorothy Fleischer, Barbara, what's her friend? The little tiny...
The money was there
Barbara
for a
Kaplan.
while.
Barbara
Barbara
Kaplan.
Kaplan, B.J. Spittler,
remember
Marty
her.
Beeman, Marty Singleton. You know, there were a lot. I think that there were a number of people. I
Yes.
think the ties
Yes.
are worth noting because I think we all contributed.
Yeah, I think those are significant, and I'll get those picked up in the survey
Yeah,
that
yeah.
we're developing. But when you mentioned the range of literature, don't forget your joke book.
Yes,
Oh,
your humor.
because that was the data. The data was collected by elderly people from elderly people.
Great. I can't keep my copy in my office. It's always floating around amongst staff, and I don't want to lose it. I don't want to lose it, so I keep
You know,
trying to
that
chase-
has made $10,000,
Oh, wonderful.
$5 a book, and it goes right past me. It was all volunteer, and let's see, what do they call it? There's a foundation for aging. It's a fundraising agency attached to the public agency so that they can raise money.
Right.
And they do all the collecting of the money and dispersing it and keeping a track and account of it and so on. So that the last report was about $10,000, and it all went to the into the programs for the low-income aging.
Great.
Now, do you think of any other significant things that we should keep in mind in talking about the impacts of the School of Social Work in various fields and various arenas?
Well, I think we have mentioned the task analysis type of approach, or the sort of the business of time and motion, or use of time, which partly I carried through. I think some of the same ideas that didn't come from the adolescent study when we were trying to find out what did adolescents do, and the one category that was used so much was fooling around.
No, but Jen, that was not at USC.
No.
Let's stay with
That's
SC.
right.
I'm not giving publicity to other universities.
Yeah, University of California. Yeah.
I just want to be sure that whatever you think should be kept in mind, whether we ultimately include it or not.
It seems
we
like
do touch on it.
this matter of trying to locate just where I was. I think it must have been in Southern California, because we did with the USC, because I didn't have full charge. I was a consultant, and it had to do with early release from hospitals and home care, and with a sample group that had been released early, that was selected as a very good sample for a public, the charity hospital type thing.
Was that when you were in the Welfare Planning Council?
No, it doesn't seem to be. That's why I can't place the time of it. But it was in this period of when we were doing use of time in family agencies. So I guess maybe that was whenever, because we did have a lot of students in on that. They must have been USC students, because there were no other place that it was, no other place that we would find these people to do the home interviewing. So it's a little bit doubtful.
Well, the reason I say wasn't it when you were at the research?
No.
You don't think it was, because it seemed to me that Al in the health division was involved in some way in that.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure. It's not clear. I couldn't say for sure. But I do remember the study of nursing functions. That again, I had a very good, strong interest in breaking down the job, or trying to first describe the job.
That wasn't with the older people, though.
No, it wasn't necessarily with older ones. Not in gerontology.
You think that something was written? Would it be part of the
Well, the reason I connect it with her days in the Welfare Council is because Al headed the health division, and he was involved in that, some kind of activity related to that.
Where was he working now? I forgot.
He was head of the of the health division in the Welfare Planning Council. He came back to that after we returned from Chicago. In fact, we returned early because Whit Pfeiffer came to Chicago to convince him to come back so that they could reorganize. So that's why I associate it with that period. Max Silverstein had left.
Oh, yes. I remember.
He'd gone to Pennsylvania.
Just a little side comment. He was going to leave once before, and he had some luggage given to him as a going away gift, and he didn't go. And then he came to me very seriously, thought, well, should he, since he was going to get another party, this time he was going to go, and should he give back the luggage or not?
Yeah. So I connect that nursing study and the home care with that period, because otherwise I don't know why I would know about it.
Then I know that I'm sure I was with the council, but at that time, but see, with always teaching a class at the school, and always having community organization students, and we gave them very good experience, because we had area councils, planning councils too, coming up, that also, like San Fernando Valley, if you have a very strong Boy Scout agency with good fundraising potentials, they're liable to want to break away because they think they'll get more money on their own and would live more prosperously and have a larger agency than staying with the community chest. So there had to be more controls put in to prevent this of rapid growth of outlying big programs to keep them in. The businessmen were pretty
Now,
good at that.
wasn't Ray Steinberg out in the valley at that time? Wasn't he the regional person
Yes,
for the Welfare Council?
yes, I believe he was. In fact, he lived out that way too.
Still does.
Mhm.
Now, give me your question again.
Well, my question is to see whether there's anything else you think should be remembered about the impacts of the school, faculty, staff, alumni, students, on the wider community.
The job analysis, I think, was important because I carried that to Washington, the federal agency,
Mm-hmm.
and we made use of that in our own department we had 50 people, so that was a lot.
I think that's an important point.
And that's so that there was we carried things that we're doing at USC into the HEW, as it was called then,
Mm-hmm.
Health, Education, and Welfare. And then another interesting thing that made it important was the fact that the secretary's level has no allocation of budget or money, only as they can draw it from the member agencies that deliver the service, like child welfare or health and so on, because the legislation is based on the individual agency, and it's only a little top or a percentage that the secretary's office get, and they have very aggressive staff that's always trying to create some kind of a scheme to get the money from these the various agencies that make up HEW, and some of them were pretty rough. It's rough stuff trying to. They created what they call integration. We talked about that yesterday. So they wanted integration of research. It's cheaper, you get more, you save money, and so on. And then they would be the ones to integrate the research part of your budget, so that it's unrelated to what the school influences. Well, I was certainly any experience I brought there was sort of a protective one of how to with my interest in community organization and organizations and how they function. See, that was fairly new in those days too, on just how you work with communities or organized groups or committees, which didn't come through casework or anything. So that it gave me a lot more. My USC experience gave me some techniques and so on, and philosophy to use that really protected at times the funds I had to work with in HEW to keep use my own methods of building network and so on. And
well, you talked earlier about something that I associated in my mind with another thing that Jen was responsible for starting. You talked about statewide coordinating sessions, and made me think about the time when we were just finishing but not yet finished with the Alaska project, and you suggested that we ought to bring all these federal researchers in to Santa Monica and have a conference and tell them about this, and we brought 2 of the Eskimos down. It was a remarkable meeting.
I'll never forget one.
And I still occasionally will hear from one of those researchers who was there, who wants to know, do I remember about such and such a thing that was mentioned at that meeting? But it had an impact not only on kinds of demonstration research and the importance of consulting with the group before the project ends, because when it ends it's too late to get the learnings. But also there was a lot about ethnic and racial and geographic
Oh, yes.
cultural differences. It was quite a remarkable thing. Now, I don't remember how many people were there, but there were about 50 people.
Oh, at least 50.
At least 50.
And
But
there
this was Jen's idea.
But and I remember so well. My favorite story is that the impact of the Eskimo people on the rest of the conference group.
Yeah, I bet.
So, on one occasion, they were telling about whenever parents would run off and leave the children, get drunk and so on, they'd have to come in to the house and do everything from washing diapers to cooking something and taking care of the babies and so on. And then how they had to stay overnight to get into one place, and a big caribou came in the night. So that
He was so funny. Somebody had been injured. They asked for an example of what they do, and somebody had been injured, and he had gone by snow sled for 8 hours and found this stranded family with the man with a broken leg. It was too late at night. It was too dark to come back. And so he bedded everybody down, and he woke
Cleaned
up
the
in the
babies.
morning, and there was a moose elk standing over him. And somebody said, "What did you do?" He said, "I stayed quiet and pretended to be asleep until he walked away. Then I gathered everybody else." And then somebody said to him, "Why do you stay there? Life
yeah,
is
that's
so
a
hard."
comment.
Yeah.
And he said, he puzzled for a while. He said, "It's my home."
No, he said because it's my home. I live there.
That had quite an impact.
Oh, everybody
that
was
conference.
so still because he paused and then he said it, and it was the real right answer. And everybody, if it's so damn hard, why do you hang around there? It was the question was posed in a kind of an impudent manner, but it was answered with the greatest dignity.
Yeah, and so when you talked about this state coordination meeting, I remembered that conference, and I think it had an impact too that we should note.
Yes,
But that was Jen's idea.
Jen, I don't know who it was, George Maddox or someone like that. It made me think of it when you were coordination means you want to do something with my resources.
yeah, that's still,
Which is true. I always thought that was a really fine definition.
yes, and that comes through the edges in the study here with that Helen Dean study, but it's never quite
said.
She doesn't quite sense some of the sensitive things she has in there.
Well, in the 60s, when there seemed to be plenty of money to do everything.
Yes,
Everybody
Oh,
had money.
the great year,
There
60.
wasn't any coordination. Everybody just did it.
I came
mean-
after what was called the 62 amendments
Yeah.
that nobody knew quite how to implement. And it was because it was so heavily weighted by, there was a power play between social workers and other disciplines at that time, at the federal level. So again,
Well, and also between public-private,
yes,
because
oh yes,
the 62 amendments provided for demonstration projects of public money going to private agencies. Remember, this had been prohibited for many years, and the DPSS, I forgot what its name was then, under Murphy, made money available to 2 private settlement groups. and they were to demonstrate what they could do with that money. And as part of Project 220, do you remember Project 220? This had already been made available. I went to those agencies to look at what they had done. And one of the people, I'm going to turn this up, as a result of that experience of evaluating those two and what could go wrong, we made a series of recommendations that went to HEW to keep as guidelines if funds were given to private agencies and how they had to be accounted for.
Yeah.
And those were incorporated in subsequent legislation. I'll never forget those handwritten, cursive writing reports, all saying almost exactly the same thing and the same handwriting, but all with different signatures.
Well, I know from the courses over the years that I have taught in grant writing, I like to point to the 60s when I actually began working on grants. They just used to, there was almost no accountability anywhere.
No, there wasn't.
It was sort of a go forth and do good era.
Well, I think there was an expectation that people were so honorable and they were so involved in providing good services that they would.
Yes.
All they needed was some money to do it.
That was the idea.
The coordination, integration, and all that certainly took a turn with Nixon and all the accountability. It almost, the pendulum swung
That's right.
really the other way, and it took a while to
The Johnson years were the years where
expansive.
and where there were certain grants for everything.
There were grants for everything.
And you involved the community
yes, and
in
to
everything.
community we had the neighborhood adult participation projects.
Yeah. And,
Local
some
Joe.
of
They
them,
were the golden years, really.
except that some of them really worked to the disadvantage of the social work profession.
Oh, yes.
Because if people had problems, had lived through problems in a community, they were ipso facto able to deal with the problems of
Experts.
others. So standards for employment were decimated, and community people came in who didn't know what they were doing
That's right.
and could not look at other people. They could only look at themselves. And we saw it on all kinds of public committees and in the staff. We lost in our public agencies at the county level a large proportion of the social workers who were trained either professionally or by in-service training to deal with issues. They never have recovered from that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it just took some people longer to realize some of the disadvantages of that era while we were going through it. It
Yeah.
wasn't.
See, I don't know if this is true in other states, but some like what my orthopedist, we had some disagreements about. I thought I was put out of the hospital too quickly,
Yeah.
and I asked for the form for the patient to protest. That was because I was. I'm sure I was having some little strokes. And nobody asked me how I felt or anything. It's just that you'll be out. You're going to be discharged in 4 hours and so on. So you don't have anybody that's on your side.
Yeah, it certainly does.
You
feel
can't
that
call
way.
your primary physician in
No.
because that part is delegated, and he signed the admission because my X-rays for broken bones, you don't need high level primary care. Usually, supposing I'm a 12-year-old boy who falls out of the apple tree is different from an old lady who's getting very disturbed and having little headaches where she passes out now and then. It's a whole different story. It depends on how it's written up, and there are a lot of loopholes like that are going to have to be tied together.
Well, let's discuss that over dinner. I really must catch you up on some things that are going on in case management that will be of great interest to you. But we only have about 15 minutes.
I'm glad you got to that. Let me see what else.
I think we have a dinner reservation.
Let me just see.
What are you asking about? Oh, the Regional Research Institute, Jen.
I think she must have something else
Do you
down.
have something between?
No, I had some other things here. Well, the task analysis. This had to do with the business influence at this period, where the school was involved so much. I don't see anything that I haven't at least touched on a little bit. What seems to slip my mind, I get blurred in my memories with what happened when I at the research institute, which was really a plan to have decentralized research from human services to the 7 or 8 territorial regions of the country, and San Francisco was Region 8 headquarters.
Region 9.
Region 9.
Yeah, Region 9.
Region 9.
Mm-hmm.
And so that I'll need some reminders. The one that came to mind was that thesis on the Japanese children's home.
Well, one of the things that the one that I was involved in with you 20 years ago, Jen, at the Institute, we were looking at that project with Frances Lear, of Lear's magazine. Do you remember?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, in putting welfare mothers
yeah.
to work in the private sector.
Exactly.
And there was this public-private partnership type of approach to employment. And I personally part of my job on that project was to review thousands, we reviewed thousands of welfare records at the whatever, I forget now before they were unemployment offices or whatever those offices were. And I personally went through about 1,000 myself. We had set up some criteria for what kind of women we were looking for in terms of education, number of children, ages, former employment. We had these standards, looking for women that we might place in part-time positions during school hours so that their children could be in school and they could be working during that period of time and still be home in the mornings and in the evenings.
No, see, you remind me of
and how few we found. That's what sticks with me 20 years later.
Well, what sticks with me all of a sudden is along the same line. It was job training evaluation studies, and that after they get through, they come out of this tunnel and training, then there's no job. You see.
Right.
And so is it a success or not?
Well, first it was finding the jobs, and that's where Frances Lear came in. Because she had, if you remember, an employment agency in Century City, because I worked in her office for part of this, also doing the other side, and she had opened an employment office for kind of high-level executive secretary types if I remember, the office, but a little on the higher level. And she was interested in entry-level jobs in offices, filing, and so she wanted to help us place the welfare mothers into such offices, in such environments. And it was on the job training. We had to talk the business end into accepting and training these women. And then it was part-time work for some period of time. And I forget, were we paying them a little bit, or at least part of their salary? The project was paying. And then, like you say, there was not, afterwards, there were very few who actually stayed on
Yes, and that
with
was,
any kind of work put past
well,
the
stayed
project.
on. I remember this very strange finding we had. I don't know whether it was that particular study or not, but the dropouts were the ones who got jobs because they were on their own looking for a job
Yeah.
and highly motivated
Right.
and didn't finish the training.
Right.
So what you come out with, the result is that those who were found working X number of days or months afterwards were the ones who didn't complete the training.
And they found jobs on their own, and they would have anyway.
Yes,
and
correct.
They would
And
have
that's very
anyway.
significant
And it
in
was
light of
very
today's
significant.
proposals.
Very significant. And many of them went into this project, the ones who were working later, because it was a wonderful bridge in between, because they didn't want to be on welfare.
Yeah.
They wanted to work. Anyway, they wanted to work. And they were out there hustling, beating bushes anyway.
Well, it's because it comes, so the same thing reappears again and again, that unless the job training really does something for motivation and for the job development, where they can move out on their own, they don't complete the training, and it's money down a rat hole, and so that unless there's something very realistic worked out with job placement.
All right. And Jen, do you recall that our recommendations to the federal government was not to do this because of these factors, that it didn't work as a program, that people were motivated to work, and unless there were, I forget, A, B, and C in place, it wouldn't work. But they implemented the program, which only lasted for about a year or two.
It was funded by
It
federal
was funded by the federal government.
HEW.
We had said, don't do it because this is not the way it works, but they did it anyway. And then they did it out in the valley, in San Fernando Valley. They implemented a program, and it fell apart in about 2 years.
So that is such a crucial and critical public policy type of problem and solutions that really came out very clear and plain, but there was no way of getting it into the legislation or getting money for it, and so they repeated over again.
They did it again. It was a very significant project for me in my first, real life research experience, because the findings were so clear, and because we recommended against it, and the government did it anyway, and and we were right.
And are talking about it now in
Yes.
this 2 years and up.
I know. But that was very interesting.
I think that there's another issue in here, and that is how when significant things come out of a school of social work, let's say, it doesn't make television, or
No.
or it doesn't come on the medical hour, we'll say on Saturday, what's been done today, or new research or anything like that. It's dead-ended.
Yeah.
Whether it's because there's some kind of antagonism or belief about schools of social work, such as, you remember for a while when they were running this little story about crime, and say you call in about the crime, and you want a couple of cops to come out immediately. They send you social workers. That's insulting.
Yeah.
Did you hear that several times? I thought it was so insulting. I thought, I hope somebody picks that up and thinks about it, because that is almost like suing for damages or something. So that it's really a big gap as to how do we get some of these significant social policy research results that come out of, we'll say, schools of social work into the knowledge pool that they use for writing law and registration and Bob Dole's speeches.
Well, that's the project that I worked with under Jen when I was there. And I think then, after that, I worked with Dave Franklin.
Yeah, I guess so.
So that might have been the last big project at the Institute before you retired. But I don't know what you did before I came.
Oh, well, I know some of the things she did before.
Well, what do you remember? It's strange.
Well, I remember that.
I recall vividly.
Yeah.
You mentioned it.
Before you showed up on the job, we'd been approached by Alaska to do that demonstration project, and we worked out an arrangement whereby they had a contract with me, and they had a special contract, which was the first one, with the Research Institute to do the statistical and certain research aspects.
And the Hawaii.
And Hawaii. That was a separate.
Hawaii was for the AFDC mothers.
Yes, Hawaii. And then we did a project with the Catholic University on training. Do you remember? You and I and Kath, the little gray-haired woman, we worked together on a project and produced a couple of volumes of material. What I remember most was going to Carson City and gambling when we went for a conference. You don't recall that one? The regional
What's
office.
the gambling part?
Not the gambling. Well, I won a lot of money because you induced me to put the 2 dimes that I had in my pocket into a slot machine.
Yeah, but there were at least 3 or 4 of those studies that have to do with job training, getting a job, and welfare recipients.
And you did some public opinion polls.
Yeah, you did public
Yes.
opinion. Yeah, you did some public opinion polls, and that was just before I came to see you, because Laleen Fifield was involved in one of those. Do you remember Laleen?
Yeah.
Fifield?
I remember the name, but I wouldn't
Yeah.
remember much about it.
Yeah, but anyway, she was involved.
But I think it's important to note that material was there and it was coming out, and it was certainly social policy type material.
Well, and I think one other important thing about the Institute was Laleen was your first student from the School of Social Work, and I was your second that did field work at the Institute.
Mm-hmm.
I remember you so well. And Laleen,
She was the first one, because she's the one who told me, because I was frantically looking for a placement that was not clinical, and school had nothing to offer me.
Whatever happened to her?
She's still she's around. I don't see her, but I hear about her because I know someone who knows her, and she's still active with her community. And her, she's the gay and lesbian.
Oh yes, I remember.
Community. She's still very active in practicing her community, and I don't know if she has an I don't know exactly what her job is, but she's still active in that community. So I guess she's eventually. That is a many-year duration. So that in and that's good.
Yeah, her brother was also a different
I
kind.
believe her brother died of AIDS.
Uh-huh. I don't know what
Believe I had heard.
anything now. And is when you get this accounted for, is there any other thing that we could have done to get this information into a place where it's usable?
Disseminating the information is always a problem.
Especially this kind of
Yeah.
information.
And because
Breast cancer or AIDS or
who's
something that
interested?
is on every day, whenever there's a gleam of hope about something, gets immediate attention. But
Well, we have a complete file of the publications from the Research Institute. And one of the things that we'll have to grapple with is whether we will whether we'll index those, make an appendix which lists some of those kinds of studies.
Well, my first publication came out of there.
Mhm.
The first time I ever wrote anything. Dave Franklin wrote the
Yes,
the,
he-
the
was he-
preface, but he became the first
I think he
author.
borrowed one of yours,
Yes.
didn't he? Just a little bit
But
of
that's
borrowing
okay.
for himself.
That was my first. That's when I worked. I got a job out of as soon as I graduated with the institute.
Mhm.
My first year out
Well, that was a contribution
It
of the
certainly
school
was.
then.
was for me,
Mhm.
and I did a study on for HEW on the state of contracting between the public and private sectors.
I remember that
Yeah,
study.
because it was just the states were beginning to contract with private providers of all kinds, and nobody knew what they were doing. Nobody, neither the public nor the private, because they had never worked together. And I was supposed to come up with a model contract. And so I had an opportunity to go through. They let me go to all the states in Region 9 except Hawaii. They wouldn't let me go to Hawaii
Mhm.
and find out how they did it and what was good about it and what wasn't and what worked and what didn't and what they should have done and how they could do it better. So that was first study as a paid research person.
Well, I think whenever, you see, in your outline for the school celebration type of thing, she also, Helen Dean mentions that the USC was founded, a certain year. She had things slipped in between other things, how they got there, but it gives you, every once in a while you see something that's kind of interesting. It was the lodges, for instance, the Sonic Lodge and another one of the old lodges. Whenever these secret meetings that the men had, that was and they always had a charity or crippled children or something like that. That's in there. That part comes out as a community work or something that has to do with what the public should pay for or what a private organization should pay for. But I'm wondering, whenever you put this together about the school and its contributions to the community or the broader community, national, what can we say about it? This for the first time I really it's hit me between the eyes that there's something very much missing there in the way of communication or getting findings. Maybe the 3 or 4 findings that have implications per year in something filed somewhere from all this. If the schools are still doing something in social policy and in community building and community coordination and development of services and so on. I'm sure they are.
Yes, they are, and how that will be handled, I think, has not been decided. The only thing that I'm sure of is that I don't want it to be something that's chronological,
Yeah.
but rather by issues
Yes.
in the community and how the...
An intriguing idea.
Yeah, we'll follow
Give that
up
some
on it.
thought.
We'll talk about it.
Yes.
And we'll report back to you on it. But now, since we only have a short time left, let's ask you to talk about the gerontology. Unless you had some second thoughts
No, it's
about the
strange.
Research Institute.
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask this, but I got off on
I'm thinking about that.
on this sort of patrol or police effort to get these things together so that people would have to. When I think about what, that was so much in line
Yeah.
and got lost right there at USC. It was done there and buried there. I need a reminder, or you gave me the one that, well, I know we did quite a bit with at least 2 or 3 things with job training, and the one in Hawaii was really on the placement of welfare mothers and training and so on, and that worked out very successful there, but it was never really. I can't remember reading the finished report even.
I don't know if there was
I don't know.
one.
I wasn't
I went
involved
back
in that.
once, for one visit, and we talked about the study, but there was no report.
The one from Hawaii? I don't know. I
You see,
wasn't
what
involved
happens,
in
if I just digress just a minute to say, the structure of, under my direction there in HEW, and one study in particular had to do with the year after Medicaid. How was the health situation? And we had a 48 state sample that they used for other kinds of things. It was quick to get a hold of, and it was manageable, and we did this. And what the findings more or less pointed to the fact that the layer above the very poor, and the Medicaid was working, and it was the health conditions were better, but the other group was ones that were not with getting Medicaid care. The layer just above were in poorest health, and then the grumble was, well, we can't come out with any more research right now that's going to spend more money. We said Medicaid would do it, and it's not doing it. And there was frankly, no money for publication.
Jen, now that reminds me of something I wanted to remember to ask you. The periodical Welfare and Review, which was that its correct name that you put
well,
out?
it's just called Welfare and Review.
Yeah, when you were in HEW. That didn't continue after you left.
Yes, very. And the interesting reason was that the secretary's office, one of the little talkative ones that shouldn't be saying things like that, at the secretary's office said, well, we don't think that there's no belief that the secretary or the big political appointees will get any mileage out of this publication. It should be a slick cover with more publicity and more reporting of what the big officials were doing. And then the publication money from the department was taken out.
And yet that publication, of which we have a complete set in our library, did a lot to alert people to where the needs were and the methods that were being used to allay those needs.
Now,
research.
that was one mistake I made there, was that we did not have sufficient research staff to feed in a volume where you could make more selected use of what was the best and so on. We had some rather amateurish research in there because we didn't have a drawing pool that was large enough to give us choices. But then that doesn't matter too much. It was just the way the situation was, and it did make its contribution during those years.
Well, when you realize that Social Security Bulletin is no longer a monthly publication and hasn't been for several years, then you can see that it had the same fate as Welfare and Review.
My comment was, well, why don't you just pick out the centerfold you want and use it? That'll pep it up. And each month will have a feature of an appointee that wants to be reappointed or reaffirmed.
Okay, Jen, let's move back to the Gerontology Center, if that's okay with you. You really started there after your formal retirement?
After I came back from Australia. I was there for some work.
Oh yeah, tell us about Australia.
Well, Australia, I taught two classes. One was the doctor's thesis and social. They call it, I think, social studies, or they didn't call it social work, but that was where they did their social work training. And the dean was from the University of Maryland, and that's how I happened to come there. We used to work together once in a while there at HEW. So that it was primarily the teaching research methods. I taught social surveys, and then I had individual, 2 or 3 individual, as a heavy load, a doctor's dissertation, and then I did a seminar for advanced research. There with about 8 or 9 of the doctoral students. There.
You spent some time in Canberra too.
Oh yes, I with the Social Security Agency, and so that was also. I remember less about that than I do what we did right there at the School of Social Work. But their concern was a little bit off of what we would call most social work issues. They were more to move into, low birth weight babies, and the fact that they didn't have proper prenatal care, and that it was so very expensive, and all they had, and it really wasn't one of my particular interests. But then that was what we did work on, and it had to do with more or less hospital expenses, and plus the loss of the babies and
Maybe
the
public health issues.
yes. Yes, that was very prominent throughout their social work. And then I remember one of the faculty members was finishing up her doctor's thesis, and it was on noise as a pollution and its effect on health. So that I did not so much initiate. Well, I initiated more social work type of things, but tried to fit in with their broader scope of public health issues. Now, you bring back us, it does more to broaden the scope and the thinking of the person who's doing the teaching of research than it does maybe the student body and so on, although you're bound to have some influence there. But that was a strange situation in terms of my experience, which I did bring back, and it did have some effect on what I taught and said. But it wasn't. I didn't feel that I brought more just techniques, and we did task analysis and differentiation of jobs with social welfare. I guess that's what they were training, social welfare workers or social workers, and the working with, they had never worked with nurses and so on with social workers before.
So they were beginning to do some interdisciplinary.
Yeah, that's correct, and more like what would be not only the edge of case management.
Well, while you were in Melbourne and Canberra in 1975, wasn't it? 1975.
Yes, it was. My husband died in '72. That I went about a year later.
Yeah, and at the same time we had faculty working in Perth with
Yes.
working with the school, two schools there, Elizabeth McBroom and then Bob Roberts was there.
It seemed to me that Elizabeth had just came back
She
about
was
the time
there-
I went.
She was there twice.
Oh, that.
She was
guess
there the first time just before you went, and then she went back again, and then Alton Linford from Chicago followed Bob and really established the school at the Western Institute. And I went to visit him a couple of times and brought material from our school that he could use there. So there was a lot of interaction from the United States schools and the Australian experiences.
Yes, and I think. Well, of course, they didn't have the casework background that we've had in this country.
No, but that's what Alton was working on when. Now Bob started to work on casework, and Helen Northern then went also for a while
Yes.
and brought group work there, and Alton integrated all of these. He was in Los Angeles a month or so ago, and we were reminiscing over what had happened.
I think my contribution was more in the social
In the
in the
research.
social survey and in social policy research.
Yeah.
Particularly that is expenditures and costs, which they had not paid much attention to, and plus the fact that it was more interdisciplinary type of looking at issues instead. Not that I wasn't the caseworker anyway, so I did more of community organization type of thinking, which gets into coordination and gets into the interdisciplinary approach, which they grasp it eagerly because it fits in to their kind of thinking.
Well, actually, as a result of your being where you were and then these other people being in Perth, they began to send us students for field placement, which various members of our faculty, their placements were in California, but members of our faculty provided the field supervision for them, and that all came out of this. Now let's get to gerontology.
All right, I think, well, gerontology came as a natural interest because we know I began with the Harold and Mary Jones Child Welfare Institute at Berkeley, which was one of the biggest and the best, or at least I thought one of the best in the country. And so the childhood and adolescence, and I was working, that was how I paid my way through, was on the adolescent study, because we were just coming out with the idea that adolescents and children were not miniature adults. And this matter of the culture and the gangs and so on that come from the adolescent group was where we were focusing, and we did using time study methods then for the first time on what do adolescents do, and we followed 100 or so of them in Berkeley there to see what they were doing, and what you do from what time you get up, or what do you do when you stay up till midnight and so on, and it was I think one of the most interesting contributions to thinking of the lifespan in terms of from infants and babies and the differences and grouping them, pre-adolescents and adolescents and young adults. And then we gradually moved into the full-blown adult, grown and ready for work, and then we're getting ready to move into the elderly. And then then the elderly seem to merge as a separate group, and with great surprise that there were so many of them. And that was the time that we began to say, well, why haven't we studied the elders as we have now carved out these pieces of the lifespan? So I think it was a natural move, and it's just that it appealed to me at that time, and that we should begin to get into more studies of elders and the 65 mark that we were using. It went back to see, well, who said 65? The Germans, whenever they developed their first pension, because they figured out that not too many of them would live after 65. It would cost less to pick out an age that they thought they would die off pretty soon. But instead, with better care, of course, and more money and so on, they've sort of turned the population prediction thing around to say, well, we're going to have a lot of elderly, and it appealed to me. So I started to move myself and my thinking into learning more about adults, and then working with. Also, we had summer sessions with volunteers who were working in senior centers and so on, and wanted to know more about the elderly. There was a demand at one end and a push at the other, because we had done so well with other segments of life, like adolescents and young adults and all, that it was just a natural move to go into the elderly. So beginning in child welfare and preschool, at different times I've been focused on different segments of the lifespan, and it was and here I was getting close to being a member of this elderly group. It was a personal interest, and the fact that, well, why hadn't we done this earlier? So that at first it was more of a history or interviewing and talking to a lot of older people, just as if they were strangers, because nobody had ever interviewed them. And in fact, elderly people were not used to being interviewed, and certainly not used to filling out forms with their names and their ages and what you would call to get hard data. That just, they had, I remember some of the first interviews we trained to go out and talk to elderly, they would get sick or get scared, or we didn't know how to talk to them, how to phrase questions. So that it was an exciting area and almost untouched. So that's, I think the first few years that was more of getting ourselves informed, and then getting into the resources. I don't know how many nursing homes I went into. And the first time I heard somebody say, well, 1/2 the nursing home population is incontinent. Well, that never had occurred to me. I was so surprised. And with just one thing after another. And then a naive question such as, why, if they have time to rest here in this nursing home, why aren't they all reading? They got time to read now. Well, they could read because the eyes weren't good, or they arthritic and couldn't hold a book. And you learn these surprising things about how, with body changes, how the use of time differs. And so that when you think about what constitutes a life environment in a nursing home, you change your expectations, and all these things were kind of unfolding and interesting.
Jen, did you have a special title when you were in gerontology? Do you recall?
No, it was usually around the project that it would be director of the project, of the funding.
And what were the funding sources?
It would be usually the Administration on Aging that was founded. When I was back at USC, see, I was very close and friendly with the research staff and the Administration on Aging, because we had a lot in common back and forth, and then we were on each other's committees and all, so that you kept in touch with the researchers that were connected with the funds, because it was also a question of should some of our, I think it was about 17 million, a lot of money, how much of that should be going into research that had to do with aging, and then how much should we stay out of that completely and leave that to the Administration on the Aging. So we had a lot of cooperative type endeavors between the research for the aging and the other research grants. There was a child welfare grant, and there were about once, and Social Security money was also in our budget, so that you had to have a certain amount of division on which fund, which research fund is used for which grants or which requests. So it sort of began to unfold as a working together type of thing with the research money. Now, what was the question you asked? Let me see if I've answered it.
Well, yes, you have, because I wanted to know whether you had a special title and what the source of funds were. Well, tell us then about case management, how you got involved in that and what came out of that, what the implications of that work was.
That was after I came back from Australia.
Yeah.
And by that time, let's see, I had a book published in there by that time. I forgot which book it was. I've had 5 or 6, about 6 books. One of them
Which, Jen?
Yeah.
Don't cover your mouth. Neither the tape nor I will hear you.
Yeah, it's my head that I hold up ever so often.
Was that a book after you worked on case management? Is that?
Well, that was one that I did. The other was more of where I was editor of the book. So there were the one, I don't want to get off the subject here, but Ellen Winston was a great inspiration too. She, for his national conference, I got out a book of chapters of participants who were very well known, and put that together. And we had a chapter on what is known about gerontology or aging. So that as a gerontologist, that term was not used too much. And in fact, it was a little bit in disfavor, because some of the social workers were putting out their cards for almost to do like case management work, but they were calling themselves Mary Smith gerontologists. And so there was, at that time, there was quite a bit of argument or discussion about who was a gerontologist. Is there a certificate for one? Should there be such
well,
a
but the
certificate?
School of Gerontology had already been established at
Yes.
USC. So this was a few years after
Yes.
that.
But but each time with the gerontology, it was usually my name connected